G'day! Welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Blum. I'm delighted to bring you a special announcement. We have launched a sister podcast on the True Blue History channel. It is called Cast with my great friend and military historian, David Howe. And David is an absolute expert on the Kokoda campaign and also the Pacific campaign of World War II. He will bring you accounts from veterans who were there, also military historians, and many more interesting facts about the campaign and what the men endured during that campaign. The podcast will be a fortnightly podcast and will coincide with True Blue History. I'm delighted to have Dave as part of the True Blue History team. And also, I just want to say thank you so much for the continued support that you are showing to True Blue History. It's been overwhelming, and I thank you, and it's very much appreciated. G'day! Welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Blum. Today's special guest is Army Chaplain Stephen Neuhaus, and he has joined us today to talk about the role that Army Chaplains play in the Australian Defence Force, and also the role that Army Chaplains played during World War I. Hi, Steve. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Greetings, Adam. Thanks for asking me.
So, Steve, before you became a chaplain, you served in the Army Reserve and rose to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. While serving as a reservist, was there an experience that inspired you to transfer to the regular army as a chaplain?
It was probably a long process. So my father was a clergyman, and my great uncle, who was sort of his mentor, was also a clergyman and had been an army chaplain. And I'd sort of felt called at the age of 12 to go into the ordained ministry, but did the most I could to stay away from that construct. And so I was quite happily a police officer with the Federal Police in Canberra and an infantry reserve half colonel. And I was in church one day, and a friend of mine who was the Bishop of the Defence Force at the time, Tom Frame, preached a sermon about the largest youth ministry in Australia. And he said, if you want to be part of that, you need to come and be a chaplain in defence. And as I was very involved in youth ministry and had been for many years at that stage, it sort of made me go, I need to follow this one down. So I followed that one down and sat down and had a chat with Tom. And then God just opened a whole pile of doors, closed some doors, opened other doors. And of course, I wasn't able to afford to put myself through the training. Defence had brought in a scheme just a little bit earlier called the In-Service Chaplaincy Training Scheme, and I was selected to go on to that. So that's how I managed to transition from an infantry officer and a police officer to an army chaplain.
Right. So was it so once you left the reservist and went into the regular army, was that an easy transition to becoming a padre, or was it challenging?
It's one of those things where it was a process. So I had to finish my theological studies, so that meant I was time away from army. I then had to do on-the-job training in a parish, and I was sent up to Townsville to do that. So that was also a bit away from the army, but Townsville's a garrison town, so you tend to end up with running into a lot of army people there. And I suppose once I came into the regular army, the one thing I was really concerned about was that I wasn't going to be fit enough. And I discovered that that was not the problem at all. I was more than fit enough, having, of course, of the lifestyle I'd spent up to then within the police force and the Army Reserve. It was more, the biggest challenge for me was remembering once I got in there that I was no longer the chain of command. I was aside from the chain of command, and I advised the chain of command. And the first CO that I had at Fourfield Regiment, he was a lovely guy, and he'd actually been on my command and staff. We'd been on command and staff college before, So we'd known each other before. And at one stage she said, "You've got to stop trying to do my job, Steve." And I said, "Yeah, and you need to stop trying to do mine," because he was like too gentle with the troops, and I was being a little bit too much of a CO with the troops. So it was sort of that first year trying to transition from being in that chain of command where you actually did something to you sitting aside from the chain of command where you provided advice to the chain of command and you also supported and provided advice to the soldier. That was a little bit bumpy, but it was fortuitous that the first two COs I had very good relationships with.
It sounds like a bit of as you say, a bit of a rocky road to start, but once you found your feet, you seem to transition well.
Yes, yeah, and it continue to still enjoy it too, which is good.
If you can tell the listeners, what is the responsibilities of a padre in the army, and do they have a special relationship with their commanding officers?
Okay, so there's the primary role of the chaplains is to care for the members and their families pastorally. So that involves a whole raft of different things. So pastoral care involves that being that listening ear, advocating for soldiers, getting involved in their family issues, disputes, so on. You also then, so that's the whole gamut of pastoral care is involved in that, and it's that journeying with the soldiers through their issues and situations. The other side is to provide religious services, and that fits hand in glove with your pastoral care for members because you'll do weddings and baptisms and funerals all for the same group of people. And there was one family in a 2-year period, I did wedding, I did 2 baptisms, and I did 2 funerals for the same family. So, but I was on a first name basis with the wider family by the end of it. So you do that sort of that hatch, match, and dispatch side of it as part of your religious services in the pastoral care thing, and then you've got all the more formal religious services that you do, like your Anzac Days, your Remembrance Days, and your special commemorations, your unit parades and those sort of things. So there's all that side of it as well. And then another key aspect is providing advice, particularly to your commanding officers. And as such, you get involved in welfare boards and also just going in there and saying, "Hey, boss, do you know that such and such is happening?" And you not necessarily have to, you don't dob people in or give names and addresses per se, unless that member has given you permission to do that. But you just make them aware of situations that are around and say, "Hey, if I was in your shoes, this would be a possible way of resolving it." Or they might come to you, and I've had numerous CEOs where they've come to me and said, "Mate, how would you handle this situation?" And you can say, "Well, and being a good infantry officer, I'll always give them at least 3 courses of action," which I always do in all my counselling services, course of action 1, 2, and 3, and say, "These are the consequences of different courses of action, and fill your boots." The other one is, particularly for commanding officers, is to be that listening ear for them so that they know that they can sound off to somebody and that information is going to stay just with that particular person and it's not going to get broadcast everywhere, because command is a very, very lonely place to be. And they have to make some really difficult decisions at times, and at times they have to sign off on getting rid of really good soldiers, or they have to deal with the bereavement of families and that sort of stuff. So it's good for them to have that person that they can trust, who just will, and they know that the information is not going to go out across the rumour network of the unit.
It's a very interesting job, and it sounds a very rewarding job as well.
It can be. It can also be a very difficult job. It all depends on how well you fit within the unit. Unfortunately, with Australian chaplaincy, and Army in particular, we have over 100 years of tradition, if you wanted to fall back on. And then on top of that, we've got the British side, which goes back even further. And so there's a, what do you call it? There's sort of respect that's already ingrained in the system for chaplains and for what the expectation is. So you can get a hopeless chaplain, and you'll then get a series of good chaplains following that, so that things keep going. And yes, so it is a rewarding, and it can be quite a difficult job at the same time.
So in previous wars, for example, World War One, Steve, some church leaders enlisted as regular soldiers. How do you think they balance their religious beliefs about killing another person against their desire to serve their country?
Well, I think it's each one has to come to a conclusion about that themselves. So my great uncle, who was a World War One chaplain, prior to that, he had enlisted as a private soldier, and he had enlisted with the field ambulance and went to Gallipoli with the field ambulance as a stretcher bearer. So he went as a stretcher bearer, as an ordained deacon. So he wasn't qualified enough to become a chaplain at that stage. And then he came back to Australia after Gallipoli was priested, and then went back to France as a chaplain over there. So he dealt with that by going and becoming a stretcher bearer. And in the First World War, as you know, stretcher bearers did not carry weapons at all. My father, who later became a clergyman, he dealt with it when he went to war, with that he's there to defend, and that the Bible says it's about murder. It doesn't say thou shalt not kill, it says thou shalt not murder. So it's a matter of then coming to a place of peace in that saying that you are there to defend what is right and honourable, rather than to go out there and just kill people or whatever. So, and that's how a lot of people rationalise that in their things. And I mean, I had that wrestle when I was a policeman, because I was an armed policeman, and as a chaplain, I've been unarmed and I've been armed. So having wrestled through that myself, and came to the conclusion that it's in the end, it's about defence and your motivation, and making sure that your motivation is in line with your beliefs. So therefore, if somebody says to me, I'm not carrying a weapon because that's what I believe, I go, well, that's fine, that's your choice. However, I've rationalised through it, and I may carry a weapon this time, or I may not that time, depending on the situation. So I think it's something that each individual person has to wrestle with.
No, I think it was, I guess in a way too, Steve, it'd be something for every soldier, not just padres, I would say, and chaplains. I'd say every soldier would have to wrestle with that himself.
Absolutely, and any soldier that's thinking will be wrestling with that. And it was often one of those conversations that you would have. And quite often soldiers are seeking assurance from their chaplains that they're actually doing the right thing, that in being part of this war and shooting towards the enemy, where it's most likely you might kill someone, that they are doing the right thing. And it's a matter of then going through what the motivation is in their heart at that time. And I mean, we see different footage on the news media and so on of untidy situations that occur, and not being there, I can't actually comment, but some of them look a little bit like they might have breached the boundaries, and some of them you go, well, why didn't they start firing before that happened? And it's because that, each individual is going through a thought process about, do I pull the trigger or don't I pull the trigger? And they've got to live with their conscience in the end.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. That's Exactly right. Exactly right. So, during your service in the army, did you deploy overseas? And if you did, what was the most difficult challenge you faced as you're serving with the troops?
Yes, I did deploy overseas to Afghanistan, and that was at the end of '09 and the beginning of 2010. Um, and I sort of thought about this question a little bit, and the thing is in some ways, the most difficult thing. And I mean, we had soldiers that were blown up. We had other coalition partners who got killed. Praise God, while I was there, we didn't have any soldiers killed, but Ben Renato had been killed before I got there, and I'd ended up doing his funeral in Australia. So I suppose the biggest issue, I mean, there was a degree of fear about being blown up by IEDs and so on. But in the end, the biggest issue and the biggest challenge was working with soldiers, and be they male or female, whose spouse, partner, husband, wife, or whatever had rung them up or sent them a text or something and said, I'm not interested in the relationship anymore. I've gone off with somebody else. Because those guys and girls were left in that place where they were unable to do anything to try and restore the relationship. So it tended to make them quite emotionally distraught. And as a chaplain, you also feel a degree of helplessness, simply because more often than not, when you're back at base, you'll go, okay, I'll go around and talk to your wife, partner, or whatever, and you've got that capacity to go and talk to the other side of the other side and find out what the story is and see if you can negotiate something. But when you're overseas, it's a lot harder to do that. The other one was for those people who would get a message that their parent or whatever was at death's door, and trying to work with them and get them back to Australia and so on was quite challenging at times. And I mean, I had one where this girl's got the message that one of her parents was going to die very, very soon. And so I rang up my fellow chaplain, because I had a line straight out of my office into Australia. So I rang up my fellow chaplain in Townsville and said, could you just check at the hospital? And he came back and said, yep, it's fair income, because with soldiers you often have to check these things. And I sort of felt it was fair income, so I was organising to have her return. It was just a godsend that a Hercules was sitting on the tarmac waiting to go back to, I think it was Kuwait at that stage, or we'd moved to Al Minhad, one of the two. And we were able to get her on that flight, just hold the flight for just like half an hour, and DCO allowed the paperwork to catch up. And we actually sent the paperwork for her repatriation to Australia after she'd left. And she arrived 2 hours before her mother died.
Oh, wow. Wow. That's for you. That would be a special story as well, because you allowed that soldier to say her final goodbye, and for you, I guess that would be a very special moment that you had while you were serving overseas.
Oh, absolutely. That was one of those. That was one of those miraculous moments where everything clicked into place, and you actually were able to. In some ways, you didn't solve a problem, if you want to look at it that way, rather than have somebody there that it was more exacerbated. So, so that was quite amazing, that one.
Oh, absolutely. So, how do padres provide religious guidance to people who are from faiths different from their own? And then is that an issue sometimes to the troops to have someone who is not from the same faith?
Well, the first thing is, you need to, as a padre, you need to be widely read. Unfortunately, I was brought up on the mission field by missionary parents, not in Australia, but in a African country, in Tanzania, where we had the challenges of different religions and working with them and so on. So I had been exposed to that as a child very early, and how you work with that. And that also helped me to have an interest in being widely read about what different religions do and how they behave and perform and that sort of stuff, which then means that when people of other faiths come, you have an understanding of what they're talking about, first of all. And then the second thing you need to have is a little bit of a cheat sheet, or the capacity to find their own religious leaders that you can refer them to. So more often than not, you will then, if they want, you will refer them on to their own particular faith group, religious leaders who are in the community. And sometimes they don't want that because they're already involved. They just want to come and sit with a person of God and talk to them about it, talk to them about what their issues might be. The other thing is, being a chaplain, you minister to all your different people equally. And so when I was at 1RA, I had one of my soldiers come up who was a Muslim, and he wanted permission to grow a beard during Ramadan and have some consideration for that. So I wrote a letter, a minute, to the CEO on his behalf, saying, this is the situation, and these are some of the religious things that he needs. Are you willing to assist him in that way? So as a chaplain, you have to be willing to be even-handed and step outside of your faith group stovepipe from time to time.
Absolutely. So when do you feel it, Steve, amongst the troops? Is there any animosity with the troops that there's different faiths amongst them, or are they generally pretty accepting?
Troops are pretty accepting. I mean, Australian troops are pretty much, if you're not pushing a particular barrow too hard, they'll accept you. If you want to push your particular viewpoint too hard, well, they're going to jolly well dish on you. And I mean, that's politics as well. You think about it. If people there, they might have Liberal views or Labor views or National Party views or Green views or whatever, but if they sort of express their views in an even-handed way, then people will accept them. But if they start to become a bit more militant about their views, then people go, well, you're a bit of a nutter. And they might start excluding them a little bit. So I think the average Australian is very accommodating and very much into giving people a fair go. It's just when it's not reciprocated or people become strident that the average Aussie gets, goes, well, mate, you might as well go and sit in the naughty corner. So the troops are pretty accepting. I think what they struggle with is all the rubbish that comes from the policy that comes out of the department at times, which actually prevents a lot of the fair go-ness to occur, because then stuff's mandated and then you feel, it just changes the whole tone.
Absolutely. So just following on from what I just asked, so do you feel that during World War One, with padres would have faced similar challenges with different religions during the First World War, or do you feel they would have faced a different sort of challenge?
So Australian-wise, probably not the same level of religious diversity. Certainly you had a fair bit of sectarianism within the various Christian denominations, which created a fair bit of friction. So they just had to, in many ways, they had the same issues, but in a slightly different format. So whereas now the Christian sectarianism is less, there's more faith groups in the mould to sort of mesh around. So the same compassion and grace and patience that the chaplains had to have in the First World War when it came to their sectarian issues, we all have to express now in our modern context with the plethora of faith groups that are now represented within the ADF. So I suppose nowadays probably your greatest hostile group in the ADF towards chaplains, because the religious side of it, those people that are in faith groups actually accept chaplains quite well and use them quite well regardless of their faith group. More often not, it's the people that ascribe to being atheists that are more outspoken and challenging of the roles of chaplains within the ADF nowadays. And I find that they're the people that actually often have the greatest number of issues and problems because they've got no faith to hang on to.
Exactly right. So it's not uncommon to read, Steve, that many soldiers of the Great War, or even more recent wars, they lost their faith after the traumas they experienced and saw, and basically said that if God was real, how would he let this happen? And did you have to answer any tough questions like this? And have you ever asked this question yourself?
So, yes, and I mean, there's some great examples of some of those, even chaplains who lost their faith at the end of the First World War. However, there's other great examples of people that lost their faith and then came back to faith, and C.S. Lewis is one of those classic examples, not a clergyman, but a classic example of a person that came back to faith post First World War. So he went into First World War as a Roman Catholic, came out of it as an atheist, and then on a journey with Tolkien came back to the Christian faith, and interestingly enough ended up an Anglican, whereas Tolkien stayed a Roman Catholic, which I always find just shows you how God works in mysterious ways and utilises anybody within the Christian church. So yes, there are people that have done that. And there are some tough questions. I mean, in Afghanistan, probably the toughest question that was always asked, and I mean, I had a number of conversations with soldiers about these issues, and that was about the whole Chai-boy situation over there, where and the standard answer was, it's their culture, which isn't actually an acceptable enough answer for people. And I had some of my soldiers come up to me, particularly the ones in the trade school, who said, how can this occur? It makes me just so angry what's going on there. And I said, well, we'll just have to call it for what it is. It's pedophilia. And if they're in Australia, we'd lock them up. And I said, we can't do anything at the moment except show them a better way. And that's the best we can do. Being violent about it, being angry at them about it, is not actually going to solve the problem. But we just have to demonstrate to them and just say, hey, but that doesn't happen in Australia. We look after our little boys. We look after our little girls. We respect them. We care for them, and so on. And I mean, we had a case where a little girl got sick, and the locals didn't bring her up to the patrol base until she was right at death's door, and then she died. And the poor medic was beside himself because he had a daughter of the same age, and he couldn't understand how they would let a little girl basically wither and die when they could have brought her 2 weeks earlier and she would have been able to survive, whereas a boy, quick as a flash, they'd have him up there. So you then have to talk through those issues with them, and so on. And I mean, one of the big things for myself is having been in a lot of different situations, both in army and police, is that it reminds me of the sin that's in the world, and that God is actually a good God, and this is not God's way. And what people are doing is not God's way. It's what God calls sin. And he has provided us with a way out of that so that we don't have to do that. And that's through the death of Christ and his resurrection, we can then enter into a relationship with a good and loving God who wants us to be doing the right thing and not to be sinning. But because of evil that's in the world, and because of free choice, this is why we end up there. And I think part of the issue that we have in our society nowadays is a lack of education, particularly classical education, a lack of people being able to think through issues and do a bit of philosophy, if you want to think about it that way. A lack of knowledge of what the Bible's really about. A lot of people will say, oh, yes, I know what a Christian believes and what they do and what's in the Bible and so on. And when you ask them, when was the last time you looked in the Bible? It's, oh, well, I've got one on the shelf at home. How can you know what God's like if you don't actually look in your Bible? And so for me, it's always bringing them back to that and showing them that in the Bible, it's warts and all. The Old Testament is a great area for showing mankind what they're like, for showing those laments. I love the Psalms because the Psalms are such that they give us permission to shake our fist at God and be angry with God at times. And God is actually big enough to be able to go, okay, you're being angry, you're chucking a little temper tanty. However, have you looked at the reason why this is like that? Oh, yes, it's because you're sinning and doing the wrong thing. All you've got to do is do the right thing and stop chucking your temper tanty. For me, that's, I suppose in the end, I have complex thought processes and I have simple thought processes. And in many ways, it's that making sure that my head knowledge and my heart knowledge stay in sync. And I think we have a lot of people in our society where they may have head knowledge, but they don't have heart knowledge, or they have heart knowledge and they don't have head knowledge. And I look at a lot of the demonstrations that are going on at the moment, and I think, well, Black lives matter, but so do police lives matter too. And people aren't actually looking at the stats. They're running away with the emotions. They're not looking at the reality of what the real figures are with different things. And so it's a matter of bringing people back to that context. And it's sort of great when they ask those sort of questions, because you say, well, it's demonstrating that you have a lack of understanding of God rather than you have a great understanding of God. And yes, I ask those questions regularly myself, because I think if I'm not asking those questions, if I'm not wrestling with some of those matters, then I'm not growing in my faith. I'm just becoming a mindless robot who is going, oh, well, I'm doing this because I'm told to do this, rather than I'm doing this because I've thought through, and this is the most logical, faith, or this is a faith that actually does bring about peace and love and joy. Mightn't bring about happiness. We're sold on happiness, but I don't think the Bible ever really talks about us being happy. It talks about us being joyful. And it's taking those people on that journey and then going on that journey with them. And then if people don't want to stay on the journey with you, then often you just have to let them go on their own way, and not feel any hard feelings about it. And they'll come back to you in God's time when they've done a little bit more exploring and so on. And I mean, for me, war is just such a tragedy. It's interesting, when I was younger and sort of more aggro, if you want to look at it that way, war seemed to be something exciting. However, having visited the battlefields of France a number of times now, and even Gallipoli recently, it just, to me, war becomes such a waste of human life. And you go, why do we go down that path? And then you go, well, that's because, why did Cain kill Abel? Because of selfishness, about greed, about, I'd like to say something I can't say on the podcast. It's, my ego is bigger than your ego type construct. And we see this in the world at the moment with the way leaders rattle sabers and make threats and all the rest of it. And it's just a big ego trip. And if we could put that aside and be more humble, we would find that we wouldn't have to have wars.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree. I think you summed that up very well, Steve. And I agree. I think that if we take a step back and actually think about it, that wars can be prevented.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. So, well, you mentioned that you visited the battlefields in France and Belgium and also Gallipoli. What was that like for you? And especially you being a padre, was it more significant for you being a padre, or was it and obviously your role in the army? Was it for you more special, or was it just an experience that you had to experience walking those battlefields and remembering those men who've gone before us?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question because having walked a number of them, I think from my perspective, like when I first went there in 2010, it was interesting and overwhelming. When we were there, what was that, 2018, I think from my perspective, it was even more significant simply because we had those little services at each of the grave sites and so on. And being able to do that was just such a privilege. And I just sort of was so pleased that David asked me to do that. Because it actually pulled it more into context for me. Because I was both there visiting, but I was also there, if you want to look at it in a padre role, being able to provide some degree of comfort, some degree of religious service, that sort of stuff, to the living relatives of the people that had died. So in many ways, that was particularly significant to be able to do that, to be able to minister in places where my great uncle had ministered, where other people had gone before me, had ministered, and so on. So pulled that whole chaplaincy thing into sharper relief, if you want to look at it that way. And I mean, it was interesting because when I was in Afghanistan on my last sort of tour out before we pulled back to Australia, and I went round to the patrol bases, and it was like we were within a couple of weeks of leaving the place. One of the things was I did a memorial service at the bases where soldiers had been killed. And some of the soldiers went, oh, you know, what's the point of this, you know, etc. and so on. And then I ran into somebody, or I saw a comment on Facebook recently, and of course I made the comment that they'll realise the importance later on in life. And there'd been some comments on Facebook showing that sometimes people at the time don't realise the significance of putting a full stop on things, but later on they do. And I suppose one of the things that I struggle with is in Australia, us trying to secularise Anzac Day and some of the services, when Anzac Day was a construct that was invented by an army chaplain, and it had lots of religious overtones, and a lot of the people that fell, their families had a faith of some degree, and you could see that from the headstones. So to honour them properly, we actually have to provide that religious construct, that connection with God, that connection with the wider eternal. Because if you don't have that connection, then it all becomes futile. And you see, I think that's one of the things we've lost a little bit in our society, is that understanding of the infinite and the divine, and that God can take really tragic circumstances and turn great things into them. And if you think about it, the peace that Europe and England and so on have had for so many years within their boundaries has been as a result of the sacrifices of those soldiers and the sacrifices of their families, and then the prayers of the leaders at the time, having seen and experienced the horrors of the war, not to do it again. And I think that's we've had lots of skirmishes since those two big wars, and I feel we're starting to lose that understanding of the history. And I sometimes think that maybe the leaders of our nations need to be taken on a battlefield tour before they sign the blank check to send troops off into battle, and it might make them think twice.
Absolutely. I agree that it's something that being as you said earlier on in the podcast, that some leaders they're too quick and they're too rash to make a decision without having the true knowledge and understanding of what they're sending men and women into.
Absolutely. I mean, I suppose that's one of the most difficult and tragic parts of chaplaincy, is doing notifications where you're going to tell a family that their loved one is badly wounded, and you as a chaplain, you stand there as a support person, but you have to, you're listening in while the stuff's being notified and so on. So so it's I really think that people need to have that somehow a checkup before they sign the check to go to war.
Absolutely. So what roles do you see padres having today in today's military, and are they seen as relevant by the ranks and officers?
So the roles of chaplains are pretty much exactly the same as they've been for the last 100 years. And I was about to say a bit less religious ministry, but I actually think we do about the same amount. There's a lot of different religious services that we're involved in, lots of different remembrance days and commemoration days and so on. So I think that's still there, and they still do the same role of, pastoral care, religious services, provide advice, all that sort of stuff that we've talked about. Are they seen as relevant, both ranks and officers? I mean, it's interesting you say that, because there have been some units I've walked into where they've gone, what do we need chaplains for? We don't really need chaplains anymore. Now, within a few months of being there, they're going, thank heavens you're around, Padre. Without you there, that would have been a total and utter disaster. And, I'm so grateful that you've been looking after that person that's got such an utter train wreck of a life, because otherwise it would have been consuming all my time and I wouldn't have been able to get on with running the rest of the unit. So very much seen as relevant. And I mean, sometimes you question your own relevance as a chaplain. And I mean, I had the experience some years ago where there was a heck of an amount of stuff going on around, people running around everywhere and so on. And I sort of saw the commanding officer walking past, and I was, a good friend of his. And I said, boss, I don't feel like I'm doing anything, there's just so much happening, etc. I just seem to be standing here doing nothing much. And he said, that's exactly what we want you to do. We want you to keep doing that, because you're the only point of peace in this whole schmozzle that's going on at the moment. And guys are looking over to see what you're doing. They're seeing you standing there peacefully without any issues or whatever. So they are, that's providing the calm that they need to keep going in the chaos. So that's one of the key roles that a chaplain brings into a situation, is that peace into chaos.
Absolutely. It's a vital role that you play, Steve. You really do. And at times of absolute disaster, a padre can provide the most support to people in a crisis and a devastation.
Oh, absolutely, and that was seen in Bushfire Assist, which was the largest deployment of chaplains since the Second World War, in one single hit. And not only for the soldiers, but also for the Australian public, the chaplains became that symbol of calm and peace being brought into those chaotic situations that many people found themselves in.
Oh, absolutely. And we only need to see from those devastating bushfires just how last summer, just how bad they were, and the work that you and your fellow Padres did. I guess you brought some strength and sort of closure for people through a devastating time, and made it's amazing what you guys all did. I really take my hat off. As people might not know, I'm a volunteer firer, and I saw it, but you also saw it firsthand.
Yeah, and I mean, I was out fighting fires as a volunteer firer too.
Just to finish up, Steve. So obviously, are you still serving in the army, or did you discharge?
No,
still serving?
No, I've got another 5 years before they throw me out because I'm too old. So I'm still serving as a reservist, and currently I'm sort of the command chaplain for Australian Army Cadets, which is an army position. So that role, my role is to coordinate chaplaincy across all the Australian Army Cadets, and we have over 30 chaplains across Australia, both Army and AAC chaplains who minister. So the role is it's a little bit different to most roles, because on one hand you're recruiting and training and so on the chaplains, which are the volunteers that come on board to be Army Cadet chaplains, and at the same time you also have Army Reserve chaplains who are posted to you. So it's quite a diverse role. We've got 18,000 cadets spread across Australia and about 1,200 adult staff. And so the chaplains have to, so we've got about 30 chaplains to try and cover all that. We're sort of continuing to grow, but so it's quite a involved job. It's more, my role is primarily to support the chaplains that are out there at the front line, speaking with the cadets, working with the adult cadet staff and so on, rather than interfacing directly with cadets. However, I also provide all the chaplaincy support to our headquarters element in Canberra. So, and that's a mixture of regular Army, reserves and public servants. So quite a diverse group with quite a diverse age group as well within that cohort. So that's my role at the moment. And I'll probably be kept in that role for another 18 months, and then they'll push me off somewhere else. But yes, so it's one of those, it's in some ways, it's an even bigger youth ministry than the one that Tom Frame was talking about in his sermon that suckered me into Army Chaplaincy in the beginning. So I sort of sit there with a bit of irony, going, oh, well, it's going off to deal with young people. I didn't think they were going to be this young.
No, that's right. So just to finish, Steve, it's just a thought that's come to my head. For anyone that is thinking of becoming an Army chaplain in the Army, what advice would you give to them if they wanted to pursue the role of a chaplain as a career? So
first they need to go and look at the Army website, and that'll take them there, which will give them the what they need to it gives them the sort of the standard recruiting spiel to be there. But I would say that you need to be quite a self-contained person. You need to be mature in your faith and mature in your outlook, and you need to have a fair bit of life skill under your belt. Because if you don't have those, you'll find working in the Army quite difficult, because it's not like a lot of other situations where you can, run off and get help from somebody. Quite often you've got to sit there and nut out the problem yourself. So my first piece of advice would be go and look at the website. And pretty much the standard is they have to be ordained or equivalent for their faith group. And then they have to just follow the bouncing ball through the process, and they have to have the right amounts of, there's certain caveats on how much experience the different faith groups have for their requirements for their people, and even the different denominations and so on. So they just need to follow through that. But best option is go to the Army website first up, look up chaplains, and it'll pop up with a screen, and then they'll take you to the next phase. But certainly you need to have a strong faith and a degree of maturity, and be not surprised at the different situations that come trundling through your door.
Absolutely. I think, Steve, that's a good note to end the show on, and thank you for coming on the show and giving us a bit of background into what a padre does in the Army, and I thank you for your time.
No worries. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast.